By the closing months of 1944, the war in Europe had shifted decisively west. After the landings in Normandy, the Allied push across France had forced the German army into retreat. Yet for all the courage of the infantry and the armor that rumbled forward, one weapon defined the tempo of that advance: the artillery of the United States Army. It did not emerge overnight. The power that broke the Wehrmacht's will in 1944 had been forged through 2 decades of study, doctrine, and relentless industrial preparation. In the interwar years, while other nations glorified tanks or air fleets, the U.S. Army quietly rebuilt its understanding of indirect fire. American officers studied the mathematical precision of ballistic tables, the synchronization of forward observers, and the role of communication as a weapon. When war returned in 1939, the United States was not yet a global arsenal, but it possessed something more enduring: a belief in coordination over chaos. As divisions formed, the field artillery branch became their nervous system. Every movement, every engagement was designed to be supported by responsive, centrally directed fire. By 1942, U.S. forces landing in North Africa tested this theory under fire. The lessons were immediate. Dispersed guns achieved little, but a networked fire direction center, capable of combining the power of dozens of batteries, could break entire defensive lines in minutes. Engineers refined radios, compasses, and plotting boards until a forward observer could call destruction on a grid square within seconds. The doctrine matured further in Italy, where mountainous terrain demanded accuracy instead of volume. American gunners learned to calculate wind drift, altitude, and temperature with scientific precision. A single miscalculation could waste shells. A correct one could erase a German machine gun nest hidden among olive groves. By the time of Normandy in June 1944, the system was perfected. Each U.S. division carried hundreds of artillery pieces: the reliable 105mm M2A1 howitzer, the heavier 155mm Long Tom, and self-propelled guns like the M7 Priest. But it was not the metal that made them lethal. It was how they were used. The Americans had mastered the art of time on target. Dozens of guns firing at different distances, all calculated so that every shell landed simultaneously. The result was shock, confusion, and paralysis. German reports from the Cotentin Peninsula and St. Lo spoke with reluctant admiration. "The enemy artillery is incredibly fast and precise," one Wehrmacht colonel noted. "They seem to have endless ammunition and perfect communications." Another wrote that attacks failed before they began, crushed by concentrations of fire such as we have never experienced before. Behind that power stood logistics. American industry produced shells in quantities the world had never seen, nearly 40 million rounds in 1944 alone. Supply lines from the Normandy beaches to the front ran on gasoline, trucks, and mathematical planning. Where German batteries rationed shells, the Americans could sustain barrages for hours. And yet efficiency was never pure chaos. Fire missions were requested, confirmed, and executed through a hierarchy of calm discipline. A corporal with a radio could request fire from an entire corps artillery network. Within minutes, the sky would answer. To the Germans, it seemed supernatural, destruction arriving faster than human reaction. To the Americans, it was simply procedure. The thunder in the Ardennes that December was the product of this long evolution, an industrial, intellectual, and moral machine that turned calculation into devastation. And as the front lines stabilized along Belgium and Luxembourg, the Germans would soon learn that every advance they attempted was shadowed by those unseen guns. To understand why German soldiers feared American artillery above all else, one must look beyond the battlefield, to the machine that supplied it. War by 1944 had become a contest of endurance, of factories and logistics as much as men and courage, and no weapon symbolized that more completely than the U.S. artillery system. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which depended heavily on horse-drawn transport even late in the war, the American Army was mechanized to its core. Every gun, every shell, every fire direction center was mobile, carried by trucks, tracked vehicles, and convoys that stretched from the Normandy coast to the front lines. This mobility allowed U.S. artillery to redeploy faster than German forces could anticipate, appearing in unexpected sectors within hours. At the heart of this system lay something revolutionary: the Fire Direction Center, FDC. Instead of each battery operating independently, the FDC centralized control, enabling a single observer to coordinate fire from multiple battalions. It was here that mathematics met machinery. Slide rules, firing tables, and communications blended into deadly precision. A few coordinates relayed over radio could unleash the fire of an entire corps. This was where American ingenuity eclipsed German tradition. The Wehrmacht's artillery, though skilled and technically advanced, relied on a slower, more hierarchical command chain. Each battery often waited for visual confirmation or detailed orders before firing, limiting response speed. By contrast, the Americans built redundancy into every level. If one radio link failed, another took over. If one observer was killed, another could pick up his mission instantly. Speed was everything. German troops often reported that U.S. shells began falling within minutes of detection, an astonishing response time compared to other Allied or Axis forces. This was made possible not only by equipment but by doctrine. American artillery was not a supporting element. It was the foundation of ground combat. Infantry advanced only when the guns had cleared the way. Tanks maneuvered under the constant umbrella of covering fire. Every soldier on the field knew. Behind him, the guns were ready. The psychological weight of this coordination was immense. German counterattacks that might have succeeded elsewhere collapsed under the thunder of massed American fire. In France, the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations, was virtually destroyed not by tanks, but by concentrated artillery at Saint-Lô. The bombardment was so intense that aerial reconnaissance struggled to distinguish the terrain. Roads had vanished, villages erased. Meanwhile, the technological gap widened. U.S. artillerymen employed proximity fuses, small radar sensors inside shells that detonated them at the optimal height above ground. First introduced in late 1944, these devices multiplied the lethality of anti-personnel fire. The Germans, lacking similar technology, were stunned by the accuracy and effectiveness of airbursts that seemed almost supernatural. American logistics ensured this superiority could be sustained indefinitely. Factories across the United States, ranging from Pennsylvania to Michigan, worked in shifts that never stopped. Powder, brass, fuses, and steel moved from assembly lines to Liberty ships across the Atlantic and straight into the hands of gunners in France. Each division consumed thousands of rounds daily, yet the supply rarely faltered. The contrast was brutal. German batteries, short on shells, often fired only when certain of results. They were masters of conservation. The Americans were masters of abundance. When the two doctrines met, one overwhelmed the other. As 1944 turned to 1945, the front lines hardened along the Ardennes. Snow and fog cloaked the forests, masking the approach of one last German gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, or Battle of the Bulge. It would be a desperate strike through American lines, meant to split the Allies and reclaim momentum. But even in the blinding blizzard, even when visibility dropped to nothing, one weapon still functioned flawlessly: American artillery. The Germans believed the weather favored them. They were wrong. Hidden behind hills and frozen hedgerows, the American guns were already waiting, the silent giants that would soon answer every German advance with thunder. The Germans had faced every imaginable horror by the winter of 1944, Soviet tanks in the east, British bombers by night, and Allied air power by day. Yet in countless diaries and field reports, one fear eclipsed all others: American artillery fire. The human angle frontline soldiers described it not as bombardment, but as a storm that consumed the earth itself. A German private of the 352nd Infantry Division, who had survived the Normandy front, wrote later, "It started as a distant hum. Then it grew until the air screamed. You felt the ground opening under you. You could do nothing. You could not fight back." In the open fields of northern France, where visibility stretched for miles, the precision of U.S. artillery made every movement perilous. German squads avoided roads, trenches, even the shelter of buildings, for every place could become a target in seconds. Unlike Soviet or British barrages, often massive but uneven, American fire was methodical and coordinated. Each salvo had purpose, direction, and rhythm, like a conductor leading a symphony of destruction. To the men on the receiving end, that precision was more terrifying than chaos. They understood that unseen observers, sometimes only a handful of men with binoculars and radios, could summon entire battalions of guns. The frontline soldiers nicknamed them Feuerteufel, fire devils, because they never saw them, only the fire that followed. Many of these accounts surfaced after the war, when German veterans described their greatest fears. The sound of the American 105mm howitzer, a deep, rolling concussion, haunted them more than the shriek of aircraft. One veteran wrote in a post-war memoir, "When the Americans fired, you prayed not for courage but for distance. The psychological burden was relentless. Even when the guns were silent, German troops expected them to return. Sleep became impossible. Every rumble of thunder or distant explosion brought panic. The line between artillery fire and imagination blurred, feeding what medical officers called artillery fever. Artillery fever. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but morale decayed. One battalion report during the Battle of the Bulge noted that several positions were abandoned, not under direct assault, but due to the unbearable intensity of shellfire. The artillery did more than kill. It disintegrated command. Runners couldn't move, radios failed, and units became isolated. Entire companies simply ceased to exist, not captured, not overrun, just erased by fire. Artillery is unlike any other weapon in war. It destroys without warning, without visibility, and without mercy. For soldiers on the ground, that invisibility magnifies terror. The Germans called it Trommelfeuer, drum fire, a sound they had used to terrify enemies in the First World War. But this time, the rhythm was reversed. Now they were on the receiving end of a new, faster, more intelligent form of destruction. American gunners had mastered the art of rolling fire, adjusting barrages meter by meter to match infantry movement. To the Germans, this meant that even retreat offered no safety. The fire followed them, adapting, closing in. What made it worse was the impersonality. When facing tanks or aircraft, soldiers could at least see their enemy. Artillery offered nothing to fight against, only a sky that suddenly turned deadly, psychiatric. Studies conducted after the war revealed that prolonged exposure to U.S. artillery fire caused higher psychological collapse among German troops than any other Allied weapon. It was the constancy, the precision, and the knowledge that no human bravery could resist it. Even elite units like the Fallschirmjäger paratroopers or Waffen-SS divisions reported heavy losses of morale. They were trained to fight men, not mathematics, not machinery. The American guns made both irrelevant. A survivor of the 12th SS Panzer Division recalled, "You could not plan. You could not command. You could only wait for it to end." This was the hidden victory of American artillery, not just physical dominance but psychological supremacy. The Germans fought with courage, but courage dissolved when the earth itself became the enemy. By late 1944, field hospitals behind the German lines began treating an increasing number of men with tremors, loss of speech, and disorientation, symptoms identical to those observed in the trenches of World War I. The term shell shock returned, this time inflicted by American fire. In the words of one German divisional commander, written in January 1945, "It was not their tanks or aircraft that broke us. It was their artillery, always exact, always ready, and always there." And that psychological weight, heavier than steel or fire, would soon meet something even more terrifying: the cold precision of American technology and doctrine that directed this fury with machine-like efficiency. If fear was the visible result, science was the cause. Behind every thunderous barrage lay an invisible network of calculation, communication, and coordination. The American artillery arm was, in truth, a technological organism alive with precision, speed, and method. In the U.S. Army, artillery was not just a weapon, it was a system. From the moment a forward observer spotted enemy movement, a chain of computation began. Range, elevation, wind speed, and temperature were entered into firing tables standardized by the Ballistic Research Laboratory. Every gun across a division, from the light 105s to the massive 155mm long toms, could be synchronized to strike a single grid square. The radio network was the nervous system. While many German batteries still relied on telephone wires vulnerable to shellfire, American observers used shortwave radios mounted in jeeps, tanks, or carried by infantry. These radios allowed instantaneous corrections, often in the middle of an engagement. This flexibility gave rise to one of the most feared tactical innovations of the war: time on target, TOT. In this method, guns at varying distances fired in such precise sequence that every shell, whether from 2 miles away or 10, landed at the same instant. The result was devastating. There was no warning, no gradual buildup of shelling to take cover from, only sudden, simultaneous impact. German artillerymen, trained to detect enemy fire by the whine of incoming shells, found themselves helpless. By the time they heard the first explosion, the barrage had already done its work. Then came the revolution of the proximity fuse, a small radar sensor inside each shell that detonated it just before impact, scattering fragments across a wider radius. Introduced in late 1944, it multiplied lethality against infantry and artillery positions alike. A single salvo could wipe out an entire platoon hidden behind cover. Even General George S. Patton called it one of the most important new developments of the war. To the Germans, this seemed like black magic. They had no answer for it. In reports to OKW headquarters, field officers described it as artillery that sees. Technology alone does not win wars. Men do. But American artillery was led by officers who understood how to blend scientific precision with battlefield instinct. Generals like Leslie J. McNair, the architect of U.S. artillery doctrine, envisioned a force that could deliver massive coordinated fire faster than any opponent could react. McNair's system emphasized centralized control with decentralized execution. Each gunner was trained to act independently, but under a unified grid system. This doctrine made every unit interchangeable. If a forward observer from one division requested fire, batteries from neighboring corps could join within minutes. In effect, the entire front became one enormous gun. This approach contrasted sharply with the German model. Wehrmacht artillery, though technically skilled, was constrained by fragmented communications and rigid command structures. German gunners excelled in pre-planned barrages but struggled with rapid adjustments. American gunners thrived in flexibility. Their system was built to react, not just to plan. During the Normandy campaign, this adaptability proved decisive. When German counterattacks threatened U.S. infantry at Carentan, American artillery shifted fire in minutes, covering a 270-degree arc without a single order from headquarters. Observers relayed coordinates directly, and within seconds 400 guns thundered in unison. The attack collapsed before it reached the American line. This blend of speed, discipline, and responsiveness came from leadership culture. American officers encouraged initiative. Junior commanders could authorize fire missions without waiting for high command. The result was autonomy, and fearlessness met every level. Even in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, when fog and snow grounded aircraft and communications faltered, artillery held the line. Corps commanders like Major General Raymond McLean used artillery to form virtual walls of fire, predicting enemy movement based on map intelligence alone. One German armored column near Elsenborn Ridge was stopped entirely by calculated fire missions from batteries it never even saw. Captured German reports and post-war interrogations paint a clear picture. They regarded U.S. artillery as the most formidable arm of the American military. In the words of General Siegfried Westphal, former Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the American artillery was quick, flexible, and devastating. Their use of communications was beyond our imagination. Another report from the 7th Army lamented, "Their artillery reacts instantly. It is impossible to conceal movement, and impossible to maintain morale." Even when American tanks or infantry were outnumbered, the guns evened the odds. A German colonel captured near Bastogne told interrogators, "We fought the Russians with courage. We fought the British with skill. But against your artillery, there is no defense." What the Germans came to understand was that American firepower was not a matter of chance or abundance. It was the manifestation of an entire system, industrial, intellectual, and moral, working in unity. Every shell represented a chain of command that stretched from a steel mill in Pittsburgh to a gun crew in the Ardennes. And as the winter deepened, that chain tightened. The Americans would soon face the full fury of Hitler's last offensive, the Ardennes counterattack. But their greatest weapon was already in position, buried in the forests, silent and waiting. The Ardennes, December 16, 1944. The forest was silent, buried under snow so deep it muffled even the sounds of boots. The fog hung low, concealing movement, masking intentions. To the Americans stationed along the quiet front, it seemed like the war was pausing, a temporary calm before Christmas. Then, at dawn, the silence shattered. German guns opened across a 130-kilometer front. The Ardennes offensive, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. Hundreds of American positions were struck simultaneously. Armor and infantry poured from the forests, catching many U.S. units off guard. Towns like Saint-Vith, Clairvaux, and Bastogne became islands under siege. The weather, thick with snow and fog, grounded Allied aircraft, cutting off their usual air superiority. For the first time in months, it seemed the Wehrmacht had seized the initiative, but one weapon remained immune to the weather: artillery. As German tanks pressed forward through the woods, American forward observers clung to frozen ridge lines, relaying coordinates through static-filled radios. Even as communications faltered, the system held. Gun batteries buried under white camouflage began to awaken, one after another. At Elsenborn Ridge, near the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the 2nd and 99th U.S. Infantry Divisions stood in the path of the German 6th Panzer Army, the spearhead of Hitler's final offensive. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and partially encircled. Yet when the first German columns approached, the entire sky erupted in flame. Over 350 American guns, from divisional howitzers to Corps-level 155mm pieces, fired in coordinated waves. Each barrage was calculated to cover every possible approach route. Roads, crossroads, tree lines, all were mapped, registered, and bracketed days earlier. The result was apocalyptic. Survivors from the German 12th Volksgrenadier Division later recalled the scene. It was like the end of the world. Every step forward brought another storm of shells. There was no cover, no escape, no silence. The snow turned gray with smoke and shrapnel. Tanks were flipped on their sides. Columns disintegrated before they could even deploy. At one point, 12 American artillery battalions fired over 10,000 shells in 30 minutes, saturating the forest so completely that the German advance stalled within hours. Observers described tree bursts exploding above the ground, proximity fuses igniting in the air, shredding infantry hidden under the pines. The once quiet woods became a killing field of splintered timber and fire. This was mathematical war, not driven by rage, but by precision. Each battery adjusted by seconds, each observer cross-referenced fire with map coordinates, each round recorded and plotted. In a battle defined by confusion, American artillery remained calm, clinical, and devastatingly efficient. When the fog lifted slightly the next day, German reconnaissance finally understood the scale of their problem. The entire Elsenborn Ridge had been transformed into a fortress of steel. The guns could not be silenced. For every time counter-battery fire located one, 3 more answered. At Bastogne, farther south, the story repeated. The 101st Airborne Division, encircled and cut off, depended entirely on artillery support. With ammunition low and visibility poor, the gunners of the 10th Armored Division and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion held the line through sheer coordination. When German infantry tried to storm the perimeter, they were met not by rifles, but by perfect rings of shellfire pre-registered around the town, a defensive halo that kept the enemy at bay. One officer later said, "If Bastogne stood, it was because the guns never failed." Even when surrounded, the Americans maintained communication with their artillery brigades outside the encirclement. Radio operators risked their lives to transmit adjusted coordinates. Gunners in the freezing fields miles away responded instantly, sending steel through the blizzard to land exactly where it was needed. In those bitter weeks, artillery became the true backbone of the U.S. Army. Infantry positions held because the guns held. Supply lines reopened because the guns cleared the way. When the weather finally broke and Allied aircraft returned to the skies, the battle was already turning. The Germans had lost their momentum, not to tanks or bombers, but to gunners buried in snow, working by map and faith alone. Post-war analysis confirmed what the soldiers already knew. The success at Elsenborn Ridge was the direct result of American artillery dominance. Over 700 German tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed or disabled in the Ardennes, the majority by indirect fire. For the Wehrmacht, it was a lesson in futility. Every advance into American lines was met by a storm of invisible fire. The German offensive had begun with thunder. It would end the same way. Only this time the thunder belonged to the Americans, and as the frozen forests of Belgium fell silent once again, the U.S. Army prepared to strike back, pushing eastward toward the Rhine, where artillery would again write its name in history. Late January 1945, the snows begin to melt. The once silent woods of the Ardennes now carried a different sound. The deep, rhythmic pulse of American artillery. The tide had turned. What began as a desperate defense was transforming into a relentless counterattack. As the German offensive faltered, Allied command wasted no time. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, coordinating with General Patton's 3rd Army from the south and Hodge's 1st Army from the north, launched a pincer movement to crush the Bulge. At the heart of every maneuver were the guns, thousands of them, synchronized in deadly harmony. By now, the American artillery system had become a machine of terrifying precision. Forward observers no longer waited for requests. They anticipated them. Ammunition dumps operated around the clock, hauling shell after shell through the frozen mud. Trains and convoys, guided by the legendary Red Ball Express logistics network, fed the front lines without pause. When the counteroffensive began, entire hillsides flashed to life. Battery after battery fired in sequence, covering each advancing column. In one day alone, U.S. forces expended over 150,000 artillery rounds, more than the entire German army had available in the same sector. At the village of Hufalizi, where the two Allied fronts finally met, the Germans attempted a last stand. The roads were clogged with wrecks, burnt-out Panthers, overturned trucks, frozen bodies half buried in snow. Yet the barrage never ceased. The ground itself seemed to tremble with every impact. When the smoke cleared, the Americans found that the enemy's defenses had simply been erased. The key to such dominance wasn't just the number of guns. It was the system. By early 1945, the U.S. Army had perfected time-on-target (TOT) fire missions. Using synchronized watches and pre-calculated trajectories, dozens of batteries could fire at different ranges and angles so that every shell, regardless of distance, landed at the exact same second. To the enemy, it felt supernatural. No warning, no gradual increase, just instant annihilation. A complete bombardment delivered in one heartbeat. At Remagen, where American forces would soon seize the famous Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine, artillery again proved decisive. When German counterattacks tried to dislodge the bridgehead, the U.S. 9th Armored Division called down TOT strikes from both banks of the river. Entire companies vanished under the synchronized storm of steel. Veteran gunners later joked grimly that the only thing faster than American artillery was the regret of standing in front of it, but artillery was never static. It moved with the front. Self-propelled guns like the M7 Priest and M12 gun motor carriage allowed divisions to keep their firepower during rapid advances. In some cases, entire armored columns carried their own artillery screens, creating mobile zones of destruction wherever they went. When Patton's 3rd Army broke through toward the Saar, this mobility reached its peak. Patton's philosophy was simple: never let the guns rest. Each advance was immediately followed by a rolling barrage, pushing the front line forward while denying the enemy any chance to reorganize. One report from the 4th Armored Division noted, "We advanced behind our own thunder. The sky never went dark. It flickered constantly with our own fire." The German defenders, exhausted and undersupplied, could not match this tempo. Their own artillery had been reduced to fragments, short on shells, fuel, and replacements. Even elite SS formations found themselves blind and exposed. Every attempt at counterattack met the same fate: spotted, bracketed, and obliterated. By February, the Ardennes offensive was no more than wreckage and retreat. The once proud Wehrmacht divisions limped back across the Siegfried Line, leaving behind mountains of burned equipment and frozen soldiers. In contrast, American artillery was only growing stronger. The U.S. had mastered industrialized warfare. Factories from Detroit to Pittsburgh produced endless shells, barrels, and vehicles. What Germany could no longer replace, America could multiply tenfold. As the Allies approached the Rhine, the scale of their firepower reached new heights. For the crossing of the Rhine at Remagen and Oppenheim, over 5,500 guns were massed. The pre-assault bombardment lasted hours, lighting the night sky from horizon to horizon. Observers said it looked as if the earth itself was splitting open. In one of his final reports, a German artillery officer wrote, "We no longer fight an army. We fight a factory with guns," and he wasn't wrong. The industrial might of the United States, combined with its doctrine of precision fire and flexible command, had become an unstoppable force. The collapse of German artillery marked more than a military defeat. It was the death of an entire doctrine. For centuries, European warfare had depended on deliberate positional gunnery, the slow, precise duel between batteries. The Americans had rewritten that rulebook. Their approach combined industrial output, mobility, and decentralized command. Each battery could act independently. Each division could summon support within seconds. It was a perfect marriage of technology and organization, and it crushed the old European mindset of rigidity and hierarchy. By the end of April 1945, Germany's Western armies had ceased to exist. The guns that once defended the Reich had become silent monuments to a war they could no longer fight. Yet even in silence, their presence remained, twisted barrels pointing at the sky scattered across hills and riverbanks, as if still defying a world that had moved beyond them. The men who survived would remember that sound, the endless, shaking thunder that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. It was not just the noise of defeat. It was the sound of modern war itself, and that sound would follow them long after the war ended. May 1945, the war in Europe ends. But the echoes of American artillery did not. For months after the guns fell silent, Allied investigators and military analysts scoured the ruined landscapes of Germany, measuring craters, collecting fragments, interviewing survivors. They found a simple truth that explained much of the Western Front's outcome. American firepower had not merely destroyed German units. It had dismantled their entire concept of warfare. Before the war, Germany's military doctrine, Bewegungskrieg or war of movement, emphasized speed, flexibility, and concentrated assault. But by 1944-45, that philosophy had been turned against them. The Americans had achieved the same fluidity, not through tanks or infantry maneuvers, but through their artillery grid. Each U.S. division operated as part of a vast, responsive organism. A forward observer could call down the fire of dozens of batteries within minutes, no matter their parent unit. It was warfare conducted by mathematics, a language the Germans could not unlearn fast enough. Captured reports from the German High Command, later translated during the Nuremberg debriefings, contained repeated warnings. Enemy artillery coordination exceeds our capability to react. They fight with precision beyond our range of command. The efficiency stunned even Allied partners. British officers noted that American artillery's response time was unlike anything seen before a war, run on radio waves and wristwatches. Yet, behind every statistic lay the human cost of the trauma carried by both sides. For German veterans, the memory of U.S. bombardments became a recurring nightmare. Many described the experience as losing control of the world around them. The noise, the tremors, the blinding flashes, and it erased all sense of direction and time. One prisoner of war interviewed in 1946 said, "You could not fight it. You could not even see it. It felt like the earth itself hated you." For the Americans, the memory was different. They had learned to respect the weapon they served, its beauty and its horror. Gunners spoke of the strange calm that came after each barrage when the smoke cleared and the silence felt too wide. To them, the war was defined not by what they saw, but by what they heard. The endless rhythm of loading, adjusting, firing. The metallic heartbeat that had carried them from Normandy to the Rhine. When the U.S. Army conducted psychological evaluations in the years after the war, artillerymen often showed the highest levels of stress fatigue. Many couldn't sleep without imagining the recoil of the guns, yet most said they would not trade their duty for any other. They believed, rightfully, that their precision had saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. In the decades that followed, American military thinkers treated their World War II artillery system as sacred text. The techniques developed in France, Belgium, and Germany became the foundation for Cold War fire support doctrine, and later, for the age of computers, satellites, and guided munitions. The idea of centralized coordination with decentralized execution, born in those muddy, shell-torn fields, would define U.S. strategy for generations. By the 1960s, when the U.S. Army introduced advanced fire control systems and radar-based counter-battery operations, veterans of World War II recognized the pattern immediately. It was evolution, not reinvention. Even today, in modern conflicts where drones replace observers and GPS replaces maps, the DNA of that system remains. The synchronization, the instant response, the overwhelming precision, all trace their lineage back to the fields of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the bridges of the Rhine. For Germany, the memory endured in silence. Post-war memoirs by surviving officers often skip the details of artillery duels entirely, perhaps because there was little to say. How does one describe defeat by a force they never truly saw? In the ruins of their cities and the craters of their countryside, the story remained written, a warning carved into the soil. And for America, the war had proven something more profound than victory. It had shown that firepower, when organized and directed with intelligence, could become not chaos, but control. That understanding reshaped not only the U.S. Army, but the world's perception of modern combat. The thunder that once terrified German soldiers in the forests of Europe would echo for decades, not in sound, but in doctrine, in machines, in the philosophy of warfare itself. The guns went silent in May 1945. But their lesson never did. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the world entered an age of uneasy peace, but it was a silence built on lessons carved in fire. Among all the weapons that shaped that war, the tanks, the planes, the bombs, it was the artillery that left the deepest psychological mark, because artillery was invisible. You could not see it coming. You could only feel the tremor in the earth and hear the scream in the sky, the universe itself turning against you. For the Germans, it was humiliation through helplessness. For the Americans, it was mastery through discipline. And for history, it was the moment warfare crossed a threshold, from courage and chaos to calculation and control. The men who served those guns rarely thought of glory. They thought in angles, in range tables, in the rhythm of fire. They were mathematicians of destruction, ordinary soldiers transforming raw steel and data into the most decisive force of the 20th century. When they returned home, they did not bring trophies. They brought silence. Because once you've heard that kind of thunder, peace sounds almost unreal. Modern warfare still follows their formula: precision, coordination, overwhelming fire before movement. But beneath the technology and the code, the same truth remains. Every victory begins with the invisible hands who direct the storm. In the end, the Germans did not fear the faces of their enemies. They feared the unseen, the distant batteries, the quiet observers, the thunder that arrived without warning. And that fear changed how humanity would fight forever. Because after 1945, no soldier would march without knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, someone could already see them, and the sky itself might answer.